All right. Let me push this button that says I got it. All right. My name's Ed Posey. I am a real alcoholic. Wow. Josh, you have a better memory than me because I couldn't remember whether I spoke before or not. That just happens if you stay sober a long time. You lose something. It's not that important. It's called your mind, you know. You know, I don't know really what I'm going to talk about. I know if I was telling my story, I've got a script that simply asks me to tell you in a general way what I was like and what happened, and more specifically, what I'm like today. And my story will bounce around a little bit because I'm just one of those folks that never was much disciplined in my life, and I'm very grateful for the simplicity of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, because if it was complicated, I don't believe I can continue to do this. I was having a conversation with a guy today and no, it was a young lady that just got out of a detox facility, excuse me. And I told her I had this meeting to go. And I said, you know, the simplicity of this thing is I'm just honoring the deal I made with God over 28 years ago that, you know, I would try to help those that are still suffering, you know, and I would try to carry a simple message of recovery and hope to those. And as a result of that, I found a way of living that's far better than anything I'd ever come up with before. And it's allowed me to live life, and people say on life's terms, but on God's terms, because I've had as many bad things happen to me in sobriety as I've had good things in sobriety. But I've been given a new life and an opportunity to live a entirely different way and look at the world a different way, and to hopefully added something. You know, prior to me getting sober, it was just about what I could get out of the world and what I could use people for. And that didn't solve my problem. Let me digress a little bit. Give you a little background. There's no reason I picked up the first drink other than just out of curiosity. You just want to be cool. I was a kid. I'm the only alcoholic in my immediate family. And my family for years put up with me just thinking that I would grow up, I would do something different. I'd assert my willpower or make up my mind just to kind of quit this stuff and just get on with my life. I was very ignorant about what alcoholism was. I had some preconceived conceptions and idea what AA was. And one of them was, I thought it was a bunch of old farts that sat around, drank coffee and smoked cigarettes. Now, if you look at me, I'm getting to be one of them old farts, and I do drink coffee and I do smoke cigarettes, but I come to find out that that's not what Alcoholics Anonymous was. And I'm blessed in that sense. I have one sobriety date. And I mean, that doesn't make me special. It just means I was a last gasper. I had tried everything on God's green earth to abstain, and I'd failed miserably at it. And like I said, well, let me digress a little bit. I came to age probably in the 60s. And if anybody remembers what the 60s were like, that was an exciting time. There was a lot of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and do whatever the hell you wanted to do. I guess, you know, growing up, looking back at my life, like I said, I was a only boy in the family, and I was held at a different standard than I was my sisters. In other words, I was allowed to get away with a lot more. You would call it being spoiled today. And looking back in my life, I realized that I was a very self-sufficient person. And when I look back at this, I mean, I had convinced my dad at one time to buy me a motorcycle, and I didn't even know how to ride a motorcycle. He drove across town in Dallas, Texas, bought this motorcycle, and he headed back home. And by the time I got home, I knew how to ride a motorcycle. And my whole life goes that way when I look back at it. I mean, I taught myself how to ski, taught myself how to, God, I can't remember what else, but I never really was one to ask for help. I mean, I had a pretty good size ego and some pride early on, and I don't know where that comes from. I also had a malady early on that there was always something else needed in my life. I mean, I was always rearranging, and I think the clinical term people would call it today would had a attention deficit disorder or whatever. I don't know if that's true or false. It's irrelevant to me. It's who I am. I still am that way today. And that's just who I am. But, you know, early on in life, things were just basically normal. Like I said, my first drink was just to be cool. My parents were social drinkers, and they'd play bridge and I'd sneak off in the kitchen and want to feel like a grown up. And I remember the first time I tried any alcohol, that stuff was absolutely terrible. But in elementary school, I was probably one of the hip, slickest, and coolest kids in there. I was a year above other people in the school. I was, an athlete and all these other things and whatever. But I remember one year that they had transferred some students in. This is probably sixth grade or whatever. And I was very shy, but I had been attracted to women at this time, but I sure as hell didn't know what to do or say to any of them, and this young lady invited me to a party. And I went. It was a school night, and there was older people there drinking, and I went in. I was uncomfortable. I didn't know any of these people. I didn't know what to do, but I was attracted to this girl, and I started drinking. This is the first time I felt the effects of alcohol. And I remember vaguely just all of a sudden feeling at perfect ease and comfort and like this was it. But what I remembered after that was coming to in a field in a car with these guys that I did not know, and I was scared. I didn't know where I was, didn't know who these people were, and I didn't know how to get home, and I just knew I needed to be home. Now, here's the crazy part about it is I made it home that night and went upstairs and went to bed. And the next morning when I woke up, I didn't remember anything about the fear of being in that car or what had happened, but I remember thinking that was the greatest thing that ever happened. Now, I don't know, that was 50 odd years ago, 50 something years ago. And if you think about that, there's a lot of things that's happened to me in my life that I don't remember that were really great, but why would I have that memory so clear today? At that time, was alcohol going to be a problem for me? Probably not, but I'd found something that worked for me and I had a lot of fun doing. And so, I would drink during the week. I've gone to school drunk, junior high school and stuff, because we could order liquor from a convenience store or whatever, a liquor store, they deliver it. I guess what I'm trying to say is I never drank normal, because on Friday nights or the guys would come over to my house and we'd order a fifth of rum or whatever. And it didn't take that much for us to catch a buzz. So there was always something left in the bottle. And the next day I'd be drinking. Now, looking back, I think Bill said it was, little was I to know that I was going to forge a weapon that would later cut me, to ribbons like a boomerang. Because I didn't care at that time. It was a lot of fun. The 60s rolled in and I had great plans on what I wanted to do with my education. But looking back, drinking and partying became more important than my education. So I got in a lot of trouble with chemicals in the 70s, and I realized that wasn't a cool thing. And so for the most part, those things were set aside. But drinking didn't seem to be a problem to me. And so I continued to drink. Unbeknownst to me, and there was no anybody cautioning me about it or whatever. I can remember the first time I had filled out a job application one time, and it asked a simple question. It said, "Do you drink?" And I thought, yes. And then it said, "How much do you drink?" And I had to lie. And that's kind of strange when you think about it. Drinking's legal, but why did I have to lie? But it didn't get my attention or anything. And why I talk about this is I don't know if anybody in this meeting is new to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm going to get there in a minute. I was very ignorant about what alcoholism was and what AA was. And we're going to get into that in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about Alcoholics Anonymous because there's only a few things that I really have a passion for and enjoy talking about. And really, it's not so much about me, but it's the recovery program, the simplicity of it. So this kept going, and that began to interfere with my desire to finish school and become a mathematician. So I dropped out of high school. People said, "Well, you'll never finish," and I had a high school diploma at age 16. So now I decided I would. I had a job. I needed a job. Didn't have the job. Didn't have any money to go drink and party. So I decided to go to college at night. Now this becomes a real problem for me. So I'm going to college at night. I'm working an 8-hour job a day. That left very little time for me to drink and have a party. And so I had to make a decision, and I realized that well, I didn't realize it. I just made a decision that I would quit school, and I did. And so I had a job, and I would pretty much did what I wanted to, not thinking about what any consequences were, because I really wasn't getting in a lot of trouble. Started driving trucks somewhere in this interim. And let me back up a little bit. I've been married 3 times. And the first 2 ladies I married were alcoholics just like me. And the first marriage, I don't even remember where the hell we got. I just don't. I'm pretty sure it was a JP at the last minute deal, and we decided to do it. That lady, after we went through that marriage and wound up in a divorce shortly thereafter, she hung herself in a jail cell under a PI. The second lady, when I married her, it was about doing the right thing, because the first lady had died, which meant I was going to get custody of my son. And so for about 9 months, we decided to do the right thing and live up to these moral convictions we have. And it went okay for about 9 months. I had a great job, but eventually I made a conscious decision that I couldn't take this anymore. And I went out and I got good and wasted, and I stayed wasted for a while. The reason I tell you that is that didn't really raise any warning flags in my life. I mean, I kind of, I hated that it happened that way, but I could not connect any dots between what happened to them and what was going on with me at that time. Because at this time, I was starting to get my life back in order, so I thought. Job, career, getting married again, and whatever. And I just didn't think there was a problem, because I wasn't, having shakes. I wasn't having blackouts. I wasn't going into DTs. I was able to function one night. So going forward, things began to get a little more serious. I wasn't having the fun I was once having, but I kept this thought that somehow or another I'm going to figure something out. My folks, who I said had spoiled me as a young man, they were also what you'd call great enablers or whatever. They were just doing what they could do, hoping against all hope that something would happen to change things. And they were very ignorant of alcoholism. And they would ask me question, why do I keep doing it? And I really didn't have an answer one day. And I told my mom, I said, I don't know why. And she said, yes, you do. And so she seemed to think I knew, and even though I did know. So once again, I start coming up with these excuses which didn't make any sense. So I'm just kind of cruising through life, trying to figure out what I needed to do to make me happy or fix me. And it wasn't working. It was getting a little darker as I moved down the road. Eventually, what did happen to me, because how I used to judge how well I was doing is by people that I knew that were doing worse than I was doing. I still had a job. My family still liked me at times. I still had friends. I'd never gotten a DWI. I was just looking at all these things thinking, well, I'm okay. The first time I ever asked myself whether I might have had a drinking problem, I was in Portland, Oregon. And the chemicals were gone. And I was drinking like I'd never drank before in my life. And I came to one morning and I started drinking. I looked out the window and I asked myself, I said, I wonder if this is what an alcoholic is. And I pushed that thought aside and I said, no, an alcoholic is the guy sitting underneath a bridge or on a curb with a brown bag, and that's not me. So, I managed to keep things together for a little while, and then the wheels came off one more time. And since I'd already been down this road numerous times, I had this impending doom, calamity. I knew it wasn't going to end well, but I didn't understand what the problem was. I'm going to digress a little bit and talk about a couple of my geographics I did, just to give you an idea what this thing looks like in my life, where it was problematic long before I ever realized it was problematic. I did a geographic more than once, but one of them I did was simply this. I moved to East Texas with this first wife of mine. We had a 1-year-old child, and we thought we'd take a year off and just chill out and recuperate, get back to nature and do all this other weird stuff. But what I did as soon as I got there was measured the distance to the nearest liquor store, because I lived in a dry county. I did not understand that that was abnormal. Normal people do not do those crazy things. And even to go a little further, when I was driving trucks, I got caught with my pants down one time in Arkansas. I thought, well, I got a hotel room or whatever. And I thought, well, I'll go to the liquor store. And I went over and said, hon, this is a dry county. And I thought, well, that's never going to happen again. So how I fell in love with Missouri one time, I was traveling to Missouri and was laying over up to Carthage and stuff. Before I was getting a hotel room, I walked in a little convenience store and I said, let me ask you a question. She said, is this a dry county? And the little lady behind the counter said, hon, there's not a dry county in the whole state of Missouri. And right then and there, I fell in love with Missouri. But I tell you that just because this obsession, which is really the problem, was already deeply implanted in my brain, but it was unbeknownst to me that at some point this had probably crossed the line where it was no longer a luxury. This was a necessity, even though on the surface, it still was not causing me that many problems. So now I'm going to play catch up just a little bit. Into 1993 or whatever, I've got a bottle of vodka and a handful of Xanax, and that's how I'd start my day. And I was trying to control this, just manage through the day so I could function somewhat. And when the day was over, I'd finish it off and I'd just pass out. I was dating a woman there at that time who had been court sentenced to meetings. And I would come in and talk to these people, and they would talk about things that just were absolutely, and I'm not beating up this stuff, but it was just absolutely so unattractive, so unappealing, that if this is what life looked like sober, I told myself I'll keep my bottle. And that's the honest to God truth, because they presented nothing other than a life of misery sober. And that was, and I was already miserable, so what the hell, you know? And I'm not beating these people up. It's just what they were shown. And unfortunately, that lady managed to stay sober for a while and then relapsed and nearly died from alcoholism. And, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is if that's what sobriety looked like, then why would I want to get sober? What happened to me is I eventually became unemployable. The family didn't want anything to do with me. I'd had a wreck down in South Texas and a blackout. Spent some days in jail, starving to death. You know, wound up with a bus ticket from Dallas back, from South Texas back to Dallas, had $2 my name, walk out of that jail cell, stand there, and I'm looking at a convenience store. I'm starving to death. I buy a quart of beer. That's all I can do. When I make it back to Dallas, the family was done with me. I begged my son for a ride. Day of my father's funeral, I was not allowed in the house. I'm not allowed to attend the funeral. This went on for about another week or so, and then I wound up, I contacted the Dallas Council on Alcoholism 6 months before, and I'd been honest with them. I'm not a big guy. I take 20 pounds off of me, and I'm pretty much damn near dead. And I honestly believed I would not recover from this and was going to die. My family feared the same way, but they had come to the conclusion that they didn't understand what was wrong with me, that everything they had done had not helped me, so stop helping me, because it was just tearing the family up. And my sister dropped me off in front of a mission in downtown Dallas. And for the first time in my life, I had no excuses to make sense how I got there. Not one of them. And I remember sitting on the curb and leaning up against the building that day and just conceded to myself, this is the way it's going to be, and this is the way it's going to end. I can bum enough to get a few quarts of beer. If I make it back to the mission, so be it. If I don't, I'm okay with that. And this is where I guess, you know, I believe that the God of my understanding began to work in my life. I wound up in a little shake, rattle, and roll detox facility, and they didn't medically detox, and they nursed me back to health. They fed me vitamins and took my vitals. And then I was able to sit up in a little meeting, and this is where my sponsor was. And some of you may know Cliff Bishop. He passed away. He'd been sitting in this meeting for 11 years, carrying the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. Here are the steps we took to suggest the program of recovery. Here's what alcoholism is out of the doctor's opinion. We have a problem with the body and the mind. And it was the first time anybody said anything that made any sense to me. And at that time, I knew what was wrong with me. And it made sense. And it took me from thinking I was a weak-willed, immoral, bad person to understand I was suffering from an illness. And then he talked about the solution, you know, God as we understood God. And that opened a door for me that had never been opened before, because I always thought I had to believe or understand as you did. And I was not comfortable with that, or I couldn't make sense out of this. And he outlined the program as it's written in the big book. And it made sense to me, but it put me in a position I didn't like. Now, Bill didn't like it. I was cornered at last. Ebby talked to him. He had to think about it for 2 weeks. But when I understood the problem and realized that this was going to be the first time in my life I really didn't have a solution or an answer for, that meant I was going to ask somebody to help me, I sheepishly did this, not believing that this thing would work. I did not believe it. Now, here's where it gets, where I like to talk about Alcoholics Anonymous. Had this been any other thing presented to me, I wouldn't be here today. I would not. If somebody preached at me, if somebody not able to break down the problem, and they come at me intellectually, I wouldn't be here. I honestly believe that. So what happened then? What about my sponsor that, you know, that got me to a point I was willing to ask? He had something I wanted, and it wasn't the job, the car, the girl, or the career. He wasn't selling me that. He had a sense about him. He seemed happy and he seemed content. And he seemed sincere in what he was doing. And, you know, the questions were pretty simple. You know, I asked him about honesty, and I sure as hell didn't know much about honesty at that time. He said, I got one question. Do you have an honest desire in your heart, never take another drink? And I said, absolutely. He said, that's all we're going to talk. And so I got waffling around there a little bit. You know, I got a couple of weeks under my belt, a few meals in my belly, and, you know, a shower or two, and I started feeling pretty good. My mind starts drifting. And I'm not so sure about this anymore. It starts changing. Bill would call them the worldly clamors. So I wound up having to go live at the Salvation Army. I didn't want to. I just didn't have anywhere else to live. And my mind's already starting to drift. And I'll be damned if this guy wasn't at the Salvation Army doing a meeting there saying the same damn thing. And I walked out of a meeting. We had a group there called the Bridge to Shore group. And I walked out of that meeting, and I stood in a little foyer and I said, okay, God, I'm not stupid. Maybe I'm supposed to do it. I don't care what your step 3 looks like. I'd done a formal step 3, which didn't mean anything until I said this, because it meant I was going to sit down and write it in the board. I already knew how to do it. I just wasn't convinced I wanted to do it. And that's what I did. I got busy working the steps. And I don't know, it was, you know, I was encouraged to search, look, extend my hand, look for any opportunity to tell my story and talk to any alcoholic, and there was abundance of them. I used to wonder why I wound up getting sober in that area of town, because I didn't even drink down there. Harry Hines in Dallas used to have all the strip bars and clubs and shit down there. They were a little bit low my level. I like to hang out in the knife and gun bars. But it was an opportunity. We would go down to Salvation Army at night, and after days working, we'd wait on the drunks to come in, because I'd read AA literature and what they did back then. And what they did back then was they would try to get a drunk to talk to, so drunks wouldn't talk to them. They wanted to bum some money, so they figured out if we bring a bottle of whiskey, at least they'll talk to us. We did this crazy shit, okay? And the drunks would be drunk, and they'd just be happy. All these guys are from Alcoholics. Nobody stayed sober but Ed, okay? But I began to learn how to carry this message. And I got to do this by watching my sponsor. You know, he didn't have to tell me where to show up. If he was speaking somewhere, I was there. Our meetings were all book studies, and we break them down, and I'm still in a group that does one thing and one thing only. We study the book. And that way, within that meeting confine, we're able to 12-step any newcomer that comes in there. You know, it just works that way. And it's kind of hard to stick to that script after a while, because my little ego wants to be more entertaining and do something for Ed, versus what Bill wrote in the 50s or 60s pamphlet, Problems of Alcoholism. The sole purpose of an AA group is the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. That's what he wrote, and that's what he meant. Now, how you do it can be different formats. It's okay. I love it. One shoe doesn't fit all. But what I learned at that time from my sponsor is Alcoholics Anonymous is this. It's the book titled Alcoholics Anonymous. And it starts out with the 12 steps. Then you add the 12 traditions. Now you got 24 principles. And if you get into service, you got 36 principles, which is the concepts. That's AA. The fellowship took its name for AA, which is a different animal. The only membership in AA is some half-ass want to maybe thinking about wanting to quit drinking. That's a ticket in the door. But does that actually make you a member of Alcoholics Anonymous? I'm posing that question. And I don't have to answer it for anybody other than myself. In my case, no, it doesn't. It just means I'm a member of a fellowship. But if you actually get in and work the steps, then it says we're joined together and bound together with a program we can join in harmonious action, which will hold us together. I love Alcoholics Anonymous. It's total freaking chaos, man. Think about it, and so I got sober. I thought I was going to sober up the world, and God bless everybody does at one time. I think we go out there enthusiastic. Bill did. My wife and I bantered with enthusiasm. Well, how many people do you get sober right off the bat? One cat committed suicide. But if I didn't have that, then I wouldn't keep moving forward. I've had the privilege of sponsoring people, and my job is to walk with them hand in hand until they get through the steps. And then they quit talking about my day, my way, and they start talking about cats that they had a conversation with or who they're going to go meet today or maybe take through some step work. And then I know they're on a solid foundation. Then we can talk about, some of you may have known David A. I can't ever pronounce his last name. Old AA, he was back with Bill and stuff like that, but he used to treat his prospects this way. They'd call and he'd ask them 2 questions. How much time do you spend in prayer and meditation a day, and who have you tried to help? Until they could do those 2, he wasn't going to talk to them. Sounds hardcore, doesn't it? But it's simple. We all, including myself, have difficulties. I buried my son 12 years ago who died of this illness. I went through a terrible divorce 12 years ago. The wife had 3 brain aneurysms. And, she was mentally ill and I got spiritually sick, and that marriage did not survive. So how do you walk through these things? The 3rd step said, hereafter the drama of life, God's going to be the director. That's the concept I build on. And I get to walk through these things and live it on God's terms, not my terms. Because I found out every time I make terms, I get in trouble. Now, I'll tell you this, God and I have this, at least I've got this deal running with God. So I'll buy a lottery ticket every now and then. And if I don't win, I'll say, okay, God, I'll check with you tomorrow, see if you change your mind. So far, God has not changed his mind. But I'll check with him somewhere down the road. I mean, maybe God knows if he gives me too long a leash, I'll disappear. Maybe I don't, who knows? I might win the lottery. But what am I getting at? So what is my life like today, basically? What's crazy is my whole life, I wanted to be somebody. I told you the story when I was a kid, I always wanted to be grown up. And, always looked over at somebody else and thought, God, if I could just like them, I could be cool. Or if I just had that girl, life would be sweet. Or if I just had that car, that'd be awesome. And I'm not saying any of those things are wrong. But what I found and what I've learned about trying to live by these principles is once I become okay and the spiritual maladies solved, I found I don't want to be you. Even with my little quirks and my shortcomings. And what's really cool about that is I can allow other people to be themselves too. I've got an older sister that, oh man, about 2 minutes of her with me, we're into it pretty good because we're 2 of the biggest know-it-alls on God's green earth. I mean, we just do. So there's not much of a conversation. And the relationship I have today is pretty amazing because we could not spend much time together without butting heads. And today, the trust and the respect is it's just incredible what God has done with my outlook and my reactions to it. And also how she's begun to, it set me for who I am. there's a thing about what I've learned a little bit over the years is giving without expectations. And because when I always do that, and I always did my whole life, I always thought I was a pretty good person, but I always put that little deed I did for you in my back pocket in case I ever needed a favor from you, I could pull it out. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. Not that I said, look, you owe me. It worked like this. If I'd done something for you sometime, help you move, done something else, and then if I needed some help sometime you didn't help me, it caused a resentment within me because I felt like you owed me. So that really wasn't given. And today I do things without wanting anything from you. And I think that's a pretty cool deal. It took a little while to get there. And I realized that that's what my sponsor had. He didn't want anything from me. He just was willing to help me if I wanted some help and willing to do what he asked me to do. And that is a novel idea because the first person ever planted any seeds in my head about Alcoholics Anonymous was a guy we'd been at a family reunion type deal in East Texas. And this is long before I still had a job and family would let me in the house, man. Weird deal. But we'd been out playing tennis with my kids and his kids, and we'd gone back to the house. And he was an in-law married into this deal. So I didn't trust him because I knew he didn't drink. I always kept an eye on him. I always kept my guard up. And I can't let too much out, even though I knew I was a topic of conversation. And I sit down in an easy chair after I go and get a drink and sit down in an easy chair. And he sits down in the easy chair and he looks across at me. He said, Ed, how are you doing? I said, Saul, I'm just drinking. He said, Ed, I used to drink. I drank up $1 million business. I've been sober 10 years. You might want to try Alcoholics Anonymous. And that messed me up. I mean, a tear went down my eye, and why, I don't know. He didn't want anything. Didn't say another word after that, just moved right on. It was a few years later before, I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. And this is why I'll reiterate one more time. I'm so thankful that somebody was able to explain to me what Alcoholics Anonymous is. And I'm going to say it one more time. It is a set of 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts. The fellowship took its name after that, and you will get 2 different animals, which is fine. You had the theme in whatever international in Canada, I don't know if it's 80 or whatever, it said, anytime anybody reaches out, I want the hand of AA to be there, and for that, I'm responsible. I am honoring that creed today and have been for over 28 years. We spent a lot of our times in wind-up joints in Dallas. It's a little bit different here. It's kind of harder to get in. A lot of different takes on things up here, but I take the opportunities I'm given to talk to people about this and try to simplify it for them. I call it today trying to unconfuse the confused, because there's so much misinformation if you look at it, and you can't blame the outside agencies, the stuff you see on TV. It's just, used to say a lot and saying, keep in mind, you're probably the only big book anybody's ever really going to see. Hopefully that makes sense to you. I tend to forget that sometimes. Am I actually, living by the principles? Am I actually, willing to go? If somebody reaches out, am I willing to put my name out there? Am I willing to let people know about this? I mean, you don't have to scream it from the rooftop or anything. There's a guy I'm going to meet with tomorrow who moved here. He's a professional and wanted to get connected, and we'll sit down tomorrow and we'll talk about this thing. He moved here from Phoenix, Arizona just a few weeks ago. So for that, I'm responsible, and as a result of that, I get to have a life. I mean, I've got a young man that, why, I don't know. I wouldn't have bet 2 cents on him in the beginning. He got sober probably 19 or 20. And I mean, I used to scream at this guy. I'd sit there and just tell him, I'm not going to argue it, so just shut up, George. I remember one time he was just young and just running amok in the world, right? But he was carrying the message. He was 12-step and he was over preaching, raising hell, whatever the hell. And so there was one day after that, one of those talks, and he called me the next day and I said, George, if I had been in your shoes and you'd talked to me the way you talked to me, I don't think I would have ever called you back. The guy's celebrated 20 years. He went from not even having an education to working in the financial industry, and he considers me to be his second dad. Last year, he took me to Vegas. Earlier this year, we went to Yucatan. October, we're going to Vietnam. That shit doesn't happen, you know, and it's just crazy. That's just one of the many things. And of course, we have the heartaches, you know. I mean, when my son passed away, I mean, he knew my story, he knew his mom's story. He just couldn't quite get there. I mean, he understood the first part of step one, that he couldn't control his drinking, but he was not convinced there wasn't something he could do about it on his own. And he fixated after South by Southwest in Austin one night, passed out and just fixated his own vomit. And he was just a hair from getting there. And so that's the tragedy of it. I hate the illness. Even though I say, you know, it says rarely have you seen a person fail who's thoroughly followed a path. I mean, my sponsor said there's a lot of starters, a few sprinters, but there's damn few finishers. And, you know, I guess, you know, I was always told the only way to be successful in this thing is just die sober. I mean, I knew Clancy, I knew Smitty, I knew David A. There's a lot of old timers I knew, you know, and they were success stories, you know, and what they did was they continued to make themselves available and stay active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I still have a home group, bunch of youngsters, and I tend to forget what it's like to get sober when you're young. You know, it's kind of hard, but it's kind of refreshing because you get to have a life, you know, and I wouldn't wish that you had to go through what I did before you understood what chronic alcoholism looks like. You know, I believe in 77, after that geographic I told you, had somebody showed up when I got thrown in jail that day. If somebody showed up from AA at the jail cell, I believe I would have given this a shot. I had just moved out of town. I just measured the distance to the new liquor store. 2 weeks later, I'm in jail. And if somebody had been able to talk about alcoholism and present me the recovery program, there's a good chance I might have picked that up. But what I did do at that time in that jail cell, well, I said, God, get me out of this, and I will try somewhere down the road to help somebody not go through what I went through. You know, it was 14 years later before I got sober. Didn't understand the problem. So I kept trying to apply the wrong solution. Get a different job, move out of town. I don't know, whatever I could come up with, you know, and I'm a pretty smart guy. I used to think I was. But here's the deal, what I love about this. And, you know, I mean, a lot of times concern is, you know, is AA is still viable today? I am so blessed. And if you remember Alcoholics Anonymous, I hope you feel the same way, that we've got a simple program. And Dr. Bob simply said, keep this simple. And the book says, we have a solution that will answer all your problems, all of them. I've not needed another piece of literature to do that. Now, I've had cancer a few years ago. Yeah, I'm going to a doctor. I'm not going to rely on the big book to solve the cancer, okay? I found out when you come to Missouri, they like to use knives up here. I've had 2 operations that got up here. I'm like, I'm not seeing you guys for another year. Y'all too knife happy, you know? But I joke about that and I cut up about it a lot because I insist on enjoying, regardless of what the circumstances are. And I have friends from all walks of life, and my friendship used to always be contingent upon, you know, how you looked, what you had, how you acted, or what circles you traveled in. When you get to think about some of the people you're connected to, you know, my sponsor held a master's in physics. I know people that are extremely smart, and I know people that have 1 brain cell left, you know, and we get to, you know, interact together. I'm going to end this in just a minute, but I'm going to leave you with a joke. Some of you probably heard this old joke. I was going to tell you the 3rd step joke, but oh, what the hell, let's do the 3rd step anyway. So this is how my 3rd steps always used to be, or my foxhole prayers used to be. You know, there always was a hook on something. I always wanted something from God, right? So that's when I get serious about praying. Oh, I need this, whatever. So there was this elderly lady whose husband had died, and she was a God-fearing woman, and she had heard that, you know, pets make good company, and so she's lonely. So she thinks, well, you know, I'm elderly. I'll go get a pet and see if they can help keep me company. And so goes to the pet store, and she walks in. They got dogs, cats, and all this other stuff. And she's thinking, well, that's a lot of maintenance, and I'm a little too old to have to take a dog out and all this other stuff. And she sees these 2 parrots. She's thinking, well, they may be good pets. I can teach them to talk and, we can have a little conversation. They're low maintenance. And so she's all excited. And so she buys these two parrots. And so they cover up the cage. She runs home with the cage and puts it on her dining room table and takes the cover off the cage. And the first words out of these birds' mouth is, "Hi, we're prostitutes. You want to have a good time?" She's like, "Oh my God." So she spends a little time working with these birds, and they're just foul mouth. And so she's in town a little later, and she happens to run across her minister, and he sees she's disturbed. And he says, "Well, I see you're a little concerned. Is there anything going on I can help you with?" She said, "God, I'm just upset. I'd heard pets were a good company and would help keep you lonely. So I bought these two parrots, but they're the most foul-mouthed creatures on God's green earth, and I just don't know what to do." And he looks at her kind of puzzled. He said, "Well, that's kind of interesting because I've got a couple of parrots at home, and they're the most wonderful creature. One sits there and recites prayers, and the other pecks the rosary." Now the poor lady's really confused. He said, "Well, listen, I've got an idea. Why don't you get your birds and bring them over to my bird's house, and maybe my bird's going to have a positive effect on it." Well, she's kind of excited, got some hope and whatever, runs home, gets her birds, and runs over to his house and sets her cage next to his cage and pulls the cover off her bird's cage. And the first words out of her bird's mouth is, "Hi, we're prostitutes. You want to have a good time?" The first of his bird looks at the second bird and said, "You can throw them damn beads away. Our prayers have been answered." So, I mean, so our third step says, "God, do with me as thou wilt. Leave me that binds itself. Take away my difficulties and victory over them. Maybe witness those that help thy power, thy love, thy way of life. May I do thy will always." There's no condition on this thing. And you go above that, and it said, if we keep close to him, perform his work well, we provided everything we need. And you go on the preceding page on 62, it says, this is the concept, that hereafter in the drama of life, God's going to be our director. And my first job is to carry this message to the alcoholic who still suffers and learn how to practice these principles in all my affairs. And then as it goes on, it says 77 is our real purpose to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God and the people around us. So this is what I've got to say to each and every one of you. For anything you've ever done, God bless you. And I hope to keep AA alive, and we'll just keep trudging this road to happy destiny. And thank you for having me. I'm done.